Let us bow our heads in prayer for a moment. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our salvation. And now we pray, O God, that you will speak to us, either through me or in spite of me, but that we will hear the whisperings of your Spirit in our hearts. Amen. It's Children's Day, and if I think of children, just before the service, I went to City Hall Square, and there's a lot of children things going on. And Children's Day is all about magic and wonder. And today I would like to talk to you about this God who sees the possibilities of the impossibles. The God who sees the possibilities of the impossibles. Many years ago in my former congregation, we had a season whereby we invited people to come and witness about what God has done in their lives. And one person who stands out for me still when I think of those days, well, he stands out in a very literal and figurative sense as a man called Jimmy Abbott. Now, Jimmy Abbott is a household name in South Africa. He was a boxer. He was a heavyweight champion boxer. And then at some point he went into wrestling and he was a champion wrestler. And besides that, he was a massive person. He was huge. He was about 2 meters high and 1 meter wide. He was big. Moreover, he was known not only for his size, his fists, but also for his violent temper. He was one of those people you simply do not mess with. You don't pick a fight with that kind of person. So here he was, if you see this picture, he already lost, I think, 150 kilograms weight there. So you can see his shirt, it's massive. So Jimmy was one of those very, very interesting people that I met in my life. Well, Jimmy wasn't always one that you would imagine on a pulpit. He was violent, he was feared, he was a person who was known for not only his violent temper, but he was just a washout. He himself called himself a washout. He had a very tragic childhood. He was subjected to abuse, all kinds of abuse you can just imagine. That was his life. Physical violence every day. Abuse in every kind, physical, psychological, sexual abuse, all kinds of abuse. And he grew up to be this incredibly angry young man. He fixed everything with his fist. Short-tempered, furious fist. And he hated God. After a very traumatic experience in his life where he lost his sister, he was angry at God and he lashed out at God at any moment. And then, well, God doesn't fear when we lash out. God doesn't fear his fists. God didn't fear Jimmy Abbott's temper. So God found him. And there was this incredible conversion experience he spoke about later. I mean, he was the most unlikely candidate for conversion. He was one of those people that were written off. People didn't even try get him to a church. And then Jimmy Abbott and God found each other. And the change was dramatic. Jimmy the hated becomes Jimmy the beloved. And then he went to seminary, of all places, and he was ordained as a pastor. And as ordained pastor, he toured the country, and he's still, 18 years after that, he's still touring the country, and he's still having this amazing ministry. When I thought about Jimmy Abbott this week, and I was pondering over this text for today, the one thing popped up in my mind and was in my heart, and that was that Jimmy Abbott was one of the impossibles. One of the people that we as pastors and everybody in the country, they saw him as just God's impossibility. Impossible. This man cannot change, and yet God saw the possibilities in this impossible. You see, impossibles do not always masquerade as people, but also as events, conditions, so many things. And I would like this afternoon to encourage you by saying to you through this text that we have read that God is the God of the impossibles. God sees the possibilities of the impossibles. Whether those impossibles are people, situations, circumstances, whatever obstacles there are in your life, God sees the possibilities of the impossibles. And we have to ask ourselves this afternoon, what impossibles are there in my life that I'm facing this beautiful spring day? That brings me to another impossible of God, Elijah. Elijah. When I read Elijah, and this past few weeks, we are pondering about Elijah in the morning services, and week by week I read about Elijah, and I go into the scriptures, and it's just amazing. This man who was confronted by all kinds of impossibles and impossibilities, how God revealed himself as the God who sees the possibility of the impossibles. If we look at Elijah's life, it is so much like an opera. If I look at his life, I see myself sitting in the audience, and in front of me is the stage, and then you hear the overture, and the next moment the curtains lift, and there you see Elijah, this rough and tough man from Tishbe, standing in front of Ahab. The Bible doesn't say much about his past. The only thing 1 Kings 17 introduces us with is Elijah, the man from Tishbe. We have no idea where's Tishbe. Even today, there's just sort of an indication where it might be. But we don't really know. What we know about Tishbe is that it's not really a place where refined people come from. It's sort of scruffy people coming from Tishbe. It's very country, it's very, very remote. It's not a kind of person you would expect to stand in front of the king with such boldness, such authority. But there he is, standing in front of the king. The man from nowhere arrived somewhere. The man who is a nobody arrived as a somebody. And he blasted out the words of the Lord, saying to this wicked king, this spineless king, and while he's saying that, he sends off shivers on the back of down the back of this spineless man with his wicked wife Jezebel. And he says to him, "There shall not be rain unless I say so." Can you imagine? Then we see Elijah not staying in Samaria by doing what he should have done in our mind. Maybe he should have stayed there and he should have warned the people there will not be rain, there's a drought coming, there's doom coming. No, God said to him, "You go down to Kerith. You go down to a brook, and I will provide for you there. I will provide water from the brook, and ravens will feed you." So this man went down from somewhere back to nowhere. It must have been very difficult for him. I mean, here he is riding the wave of success, standing before the king, pronouncing words that shook this king. God said to him, out of the limelight, out of the spotlight where you bathe in the warmth of the spotlight today, out, there you go to Kerith. From doing, he went to waiting. From a somebody, the prophet, to a nobody where no one knows about him. From somewhere to nowhere, from the palace to the brook. Maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you sit by the brook. God has taken you out from the limelight, out from where you feel, well, I could have done, I'm somebody to a nobody. I could have done so much more here. I could have been so much more productive there. And here you are in limbo, in waiting. We all hate waiting, don't we? I hate it. Yet, we find him there, waiting. And then something happened that I don't know if God told him that before. The brook ran dry. The next moment, there was less water. And the next day, less water, down to a trickle of water, and then nothing. The brook ran dry. Things take a turn for the worse. You see, Elijah was actually comfortable in his discomfort. It's easy to become comfortable in your discomfort. You get used to it. And here, God entered into his comfort and he turned that again into discomfort. Maybe Elijah thought, well, this is the end of the brook life. Maybe I can go back to Samaria. Maybe I can regain my status as the prophet of God. God says, no. Elijah, arise and go to Zarephath. Well, in the Hebrew, God's command to him was quite fierce. It was imperative. He said two things to him. Elijah, arise. Well, thank goodness he can go, he thought. And God says, go. Well, I think that was good news for him. I can go to Samaria. But the next few words God gave him, those were words he didn't want to hear. Go to Zarephath. You see, Zarephath was a place, Zarephath means crucible. It's a place where they had melting works, a melting pot. So what happened there was the expression from the frying pan right into the fire. from the one verse to something more than that. Where's Zerubbabel? No one knows. But Elijah, God is busy with you. God is doing some things in your life. God is teaching you a lesson. And God is not finished with you yet. And the story didn't finish there. Because the next thing he says, God says to him, there's a widow. Now in our days, it doesn't mean that much, but in those days, a widow was the last on the social ladder. A widow without a husband, without somebody to care for in those days, especially in this drought and famine, was the least, the most impossible to ask to care for you, to provide. It was a total, absolute impossibility. I wonder what went through Elijah's mind. Here she was. On top of that, she had a son, and this son and this woman were the only people in this small family left. And they were on their way to have their last meal before dying. Hopeless. Hopeless. A woman, a last meal. In a little jar, there was just enough for one more piece of bread. In a jar, just enough oil for one bread. Nothing to spare. God taught Elijah 2 lessons. The one lesson was this. When you read through the story of Elijah, this drama of Elijah, this drama with all the drums and all the fire and all the angels and whatever there is, when you read through that and you get to this point, you realize that God was teaching him 2 crucial lessons, and the one was the lesson of the possibilities of the impossible. Elijah, I'm teaching you the lesson of what God sees and what you see are 2 different things. You see the impossible, God sees the possible in the impossible. It doesn't make sense, does it? You see, God confronted Elijah right through his life with impossibles. The fact that he stood in front of Ahab was already an impossible. It was not logic. The impossibility of ravens to provide food. The impossibility of living by the brook. And then this impossibility of a widow providing him with food for his entire stay. Not only for one meal, but for his entire stay. Nobody knew how long it was to be. The impossibility of seeing rain in a cloud as big as a man's hand. The impossibility later of facing 450 Baal priests on the mountain. The impossibility of a drenched altar with wood soaked in water and fire from heaven. Impossibilities. And he had to look past all those impossibilities. And this is the second lesson. He had to fix his eyes on God. You see, wherever Elijah fixed his eyes on the impossibility, there were chaos. At some point later in the story of Elijah, he fixed his eyes on Jezebel, and for him it was a downfall. Imagine the scene. Imagine Elijah and God. Elijah, where are your eyes fixed on the brook? The brook that's disappearing, the widow, the empty jar, the one cloud, a dead boy, drenched wood. Elijah, where are your eyes? He had to learn to fix his eyes on the God who called him, on God who is the author of his faith. Where he saw an empty jar, God saw the possibility of filling it up. Where he saw the wood drenched with water, God saw the possibility of heavenly fire. He had to learn how to fix his eyes on God no matter what. It's easier said than done. And for you and me, brothers and sisters, I think if we had to learn this lesson, maybe God is teaching you and me this lesson this afternoon, the lesson of God who sees the possibility of the impossibles. When I think of Jimmy Abbott again, this man was totally one of the impossibles in any measurement of our logic. I wish you could meet him. This giant terror became this giant, just kilograms of love, spreading God's love to a world. Impossibles are not only people. What are the obstacles in your life today? What are the obstacles, maybe what are the impossible obstacles you're facing this afternoon? It might be health, it might be circumstances, it might be people. And your eyes are fixed on those, and day by day you are just getting by, just because you have to live. You're not surviving. You're just doing every day's task. And God says to you, don't look at the impossibles. Turn your eyes to me. Fix your eyes on me. And once we do that, we do what that old chorus says, turn your eyes upon Jesus. And we fix our eyes upon Jesus because it's eyes of faith. It's eyes that are fixed on God, not because we are good or we are holy or whatever. It's because we cannot do otherwise. May we this afternoon meet the God who sees the possibilities of the impossibles. Amen.